Well, hey, man, welcome to Locker Room. This is our new man cave. And if you're listening to this, you're really missing out because, man, we've got some like wall art over here. Picture Jeff Shepard, Rupp Arena, heavy bag. Got all kinds of cool stuff. Anthony Davis over my left shoulder, Carl Anthony Towns. The guys have gone to great pains to create a little man cave for me. So this is awesome. This season of Locker Room, we are going to dedicate entirely to the topic of men, which is always Locker Room, but men specifically in marriage. And so this season, we're going to have different guests. Sometimes it'll just be me, like today. But hopefully it'll be really helpful for you. We just did a series at the beginning of 2021 called Upstream, and a big part of that was talking about marriage. And so we announced then that Locker Room would be all about men and marriage. And so welcome. I'm going to dive into this introduction for us today. As I said, this entire season is going to be dedicated to men and marriage, and we decided to kick off 2021 with the series Upstream intentionally. On the heels of 2020, when we all pointed fingers, placed blame, and got very angry and frustrated, we wanted to begin 2021 by acknowledging the problem. The analogy is simple. If I'm fishing in a stream and a ton of toxic waste is constantly floating my direction, I can spend all day trying to fish it out and throw it back on the bank. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to do. It's just not the best thing to do. The best thing to do would be to ask, well, where's all this coming from? And then maybe just try to figure out how to stop it at the source. Well, we believe the problem is sin. Sin has infected the hearts of men and women, and every problem we have in culture is a result, a symptom of that issue, which is why marriage was the second thing we addressed in the series, because just downstream from the hearts of sinful men and women are, of course, the marriages they enter into. So I decided that we would spend this entire Locker Room season on marriage. So buckle up. We'll have younger men, older men, and in between on the podcast to discuss marriage. And my hope is that this will be really, really beneficial for you. With that being said, I want to address this countercultural thing that John and I keep saying and will continue to say in the years to come. The average age of marriage in the United States is almost 30 for men and around 27 for women. And that's as high as it's ever been in the history of our country. More and more young people are delaying marriage, and many don't have plans to marry at all. John and I keep saying that's a bad trend, and we keep encouraging younger men and women to marry and marry young and have lots of children. Now, the funny thing is, people, many of them Christian, stare at us like we're absolutely insane when we say that, which is relatively understandable coming from folks who don't follow Jesus. I must say it's a bit startling when it comes from people who do. I say that not because it's a hard case to make, biblically speaking. It's really not. The only thing God deemed not good before sin entered the world was Adam being alone. Think about that. In Genesis 2:18, I read recently that if you want to, from a statistical standpoint, almost guarantee an early death for a man, all you have to do is make him single. Now, there's a ton of reasons for that, not the least of which is that single men are far more likely to take risks with their lives than married men. But when I read that, it didn't shock me at all. Also, you may have noticed this phenomenon as well, but when men become widowers, they often die soon after their wives. When women become widows, they often go on living for a long time. Does that surprise you? It doesn't surprise me. Secondly, the standing command that has never been revoked or amended is for men and women to be fruitful and multiply. Genesis 1:28. That's the general command given to men and women. Now, some men and some women may be entrusted with the ability and specific calling on their life to remain single for life. And here's the big so that they can dedicate all their energies to serving in the church. But that's very few people. Paul addressed this in the New Testament in the Corinthian church, which, by the way, was not the model for sexual order and health. They were in total disarray, sexually speaking. But in chapter 7, verse 6 through 9, it says, "Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of a kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion." Paul's basically saying, theoretically, would it be a greater benefit if everyone could devote all their energy and time to serving in the church? Well, sure, but not everyone's been gifted the same. But knowing how we are sexually wired, it's far better to marry than to burn with passion, even in this extremely volatile and broken church called Corinth. So now, men, you're not here right now, but by a show of hands, unless you're driving, wherever you are right now, how many of you think a lifetime of sexual abstinence sounds like fun? Anyone eager to volunteer for that? Crickets, right. It's not how most of us are wired. Now, beyond that, Paul writes a ton about marriage, family, and children as normative in the church. Nothing in your life will help you become more like Jesus and teach you more about Jesus' way of self-sacrifice than marriage, except perhaps having children. So what about children? Why do John and I keep telling people to have lots of babies? Isn't that like an irresponsible and terrible thing to tell people to do with the situation we have on our planet? Don't we already have too many people, and aren't people the problem? Well, in a word, no. Folks, we've been deceived. I could give you a host of evidence, but I'll mention only one book. Check out the book, What to Expect When No One is Expecting by Jonathan Last. On a very pragmatic level, when a society's birth rate drops below what is called replacement value, which is 2, in case you were wondering, that is an absolute guarantee that that society will collapse in short order if things don't change. Again, the U.S. birth rate is now 1.73, so it's below 2, which means the clock is ticking on our civilization in the United States as it stands. Now, not to mention, all throughout the Bible, children are viewed and seen and talked about as a blessing, a sign of God's favor on a nation, and something worth celebrating. So when a couple struggles with infertility, it's painful because this isn't as it should be. Just look at the way Jesus interacted with children, and it's clear that how he values and views children is extraordinary. We've decided to view children primarily in our culture as a burden, a threat to women's rights, an unfortunate outcome of sexual unions that had no meaning. Yet the Bible stands in stark contrast. Psalm 127, one of my favorite verses, says, "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb, a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate." Are they or aren't they a blessing? I can't tell you how many couples I've met with that bought into the idea that they should marry later, have children later, all so they can build a bank account, have life experiences, and then when they finally decide they want to have children, guess what? They struggle. They can't. Folks, that's a real tragedy because it's based on a deception of an enemy that hates children. You've heard John and I talk about that before if you go to Southland. Satan hates children. Delaying marriage and children intentionally is delaying 2 of God's primary ways of making you more like him, period. So young men listening to this podcast, I dare you. I dare you to be different than your buddies who are going to drift from one lazy sexual encounter to the next. I dare you to be different than other dudes who are training themselves to be sexually selfish and in so doing are literally disabling themselves with pornography and masturbation. Marriage is a beautiful gift. Sex is a beautiful gift. Children are a beautiful gift. Why would you look at the giver of those gifts and say, no thanks? Christian men listening to this, if you think it's strange that John and I tell young men to get married young and have lots of babies, the burden of proof is actually on you to show me how that isn't consistent with the Bible, the heartbeat of God and the bulk of human history, by the way. If you aren't a Christian and this sounds strange to you, let me say it this way. There's a path that involves a man having to actually become a real man, to take responsibility and to humbly steward it and serve others instead of himself. There's a path that requires a man to rise to the challenge and show up to provide and protect those he's entrusted by the living God with. There's a path that has more joy, more beauty, more pleasure, and more love than you've ever experienced in your life. There's a path that has a home, a place where you belong, and people you belong with, and it's called marriage. It's called children. And God was right. It's good. So, men, that's where we're going. That's what we're going to be talking about in this season of Locker Room. So if this podcast has been helpful to you in the past, please listen to it again this season and share it with anyone else you think it'd be helpful to. We'll catch you next time on Locker Room.